Hi everybody, hello. I wish you a forlorn welcome to the year 2060. The Earth's yearly average surface temperature now stands at 3 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and we've reached a global human population of 9.9 billion people. We know that scientists long ago in 2013 told us and warned us that global climate change was unequivocal and that human agency was to blame. We remember too that 2 years later, at a big international conference in Paris, a conference was held in Paris that led to a pact agreeing to hold global surface temperatures increase to 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial, and if possible, to hold it to 1.5 degrees centigrade so as to better mitigate climate risks. We recall that the pact was heralded as ambitious, but it proved to be rather toothless in that countries were left to set their own carbon emissions, and there was not much to keep them to those targets except for being embarrassed, for being named and shamed. Since then, despite some notable and heroic efforts, the world has largely continued to tread its predominantly business... Excuse me, what? Okay. It's predominantly business as usual fossil fuel dependent path, a path where normalcy has become a matter of further slippage down an inclined plane to catastrophe. Oceans have become acidified, choked with plastic, and toxic to marine life. Coastal and inland flooding in some regions and raging wildfires in tinder-dry forests in others have left local and national administrations with diminishing resources having to decide which cities to defend and which to sacrifice to the waves or to the fire. Accelerating desertification and aridification are intensifying food security issues. Health services can... Sorry, excuse me a while, but there's some technical issue apparently. Okay. Health services can no longer cope with the illness and mortality levels caused by heat waves, disasters, and rapidly spreading vector-borne disease. Whole ecosystems have thinned in their diversity of life forms, only to finally succumb and to collapse. Species that have shaped our very sense of place and enriched our very human culture through historical time are now a distant memory. The northern polar ice cap is gone. Antarctic ice is in ever-quickening melt. The coral reefs are dead. Alpine glaciers are literally a shrunken memory. We have become inured against the daily procession of tragedies flickering across our television screens. Snow has vanished from our Christmas imagery. Masses of displaced people have become the source of huge geopolitical tensions, and societies located in the contracting temperate zones in the north and south of the planet, the belts of habitability, as we've come to call them, they are racked with divisions and tensions as wave after wave of environmental migrant seek the solace of a new home. Stepping back into the present in 2018, but maybe I didn't leave it, we need to be clear that climate change poses a self-inflicted existential crisis for the human community, a clear and present danger to civilization. The scenario with which I opened draws upon best advice as what to a 3 degrees centigrade global temperature rise would do to human society and to nature. But there are growing numbers of experts now predicting a 4 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial level rise by the end of this century. And there are plenty of the scientists who are skeptical about whether a 2-degree rise would even be livable with. And even more are skeptical about whether restricting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 centigrade or even 2 is even achievable. They doubt its achievability in growing numbers. UK climate projections put out by the UK Meteorological Office only this last Monday warned that UK summers could be 5 degrees centigrade warmer on average by 2070. And that even under low emission, if we achieve lower emission targets, then yearly temperatures, the temperatures will be up by to 2.3 above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. And that is with the low emissions that some, not all, are striving to achieve. We are faced then We're faced then with an accelerating dynamic of dark synergies, what I've described elsewhere in something I've written as a multi-crisis syndrome. In this tapestry of crises, climate change is the key risk multiplier. Climate change ever more insistently feeds into the many interrelated and mutually fomenting crises in the global environmental and human condition. And as feedback loops kick in, the climate risk is itself magnified and exacerbated by each of these crises. We don't know what these feedback loops really are to any full extent. International agreements, policy documents, and learned papers conceive of sustainable development as the antidote to global systemic dysfunction, including climate change. In parallel, education for sustainable development has come to be embraced as the preeminent means through which formal and non-formal learning can address and so alleviate the global environmental and socio-economic condition. The needs of the present and of future generations will profoundly benefit, the argument goes, from learning that supports and illustrates the maintaining of a dynamic balance between 3 interrelated pillars or dimensions. Developing understandings, skills and attitudes, and promoting behaviours that help maintain that balance can enable education to play a formative part, it is felt, in ensuring a sustainable present and future that stays within what is called the carrying capacity of the planet. And to achieve that goal, great emphasis is placed on the transformative intent and potential of ESD. One sees that in international policy literature and other documents, academic and professional documents, the emphasis is on transformation. I'm sorry, something's... Okay, cheers. Okay. But that is... doesn't seem to be reacting to change. I'm sorry. There we are. Let's try again. You see, excuse me, this seems a little slow. Okay, and if we look at these international documents, we find, and I won't read this through, but the term transformation is always there. UNESCO 2013 in its roadmap for post-2015. ESD is holistic and transformational education. The UK Handbook on Sustainable Literacy talks about the need for social, economic and cultural transformation. The Vals and Corcoran in 2006 talked about the importance of transformative social learning to achieve sustainability. And so something similar is said by a New Zealand document. Now, if ESD is meant to be transformative, what does that mean in terms of learning? In recent times, there have been significant attempts to flesh out what transformative sustainability education might look like. I want now to have a quick cook's journey, travel through a few of the more recent and important suggestions. US academic Heather Burns, for her, transformative learning is fundamental to sustainability education. The design of what she calls transformative sustainability pedagogy needs to do a number of things. It needs to draw upon ecological wisdom and mirror ecosystems in the design and movement of learning programs. So forms of learning that emphasize interrelationship, shared construction of meaning, multi-directional energy flows within the learning community, horizontally between the students, vertically with teacher and students, but also seeing the community as a part of a porous system in learning in which students do not stay in school so much, but go out and work within the community. So a dynamic picture of flows of energy, etc. She also says that we should draw upon indigenous wisdom concerning the whole self, so that we work from an expanded concept of self, not self ending at my epidermis, but realizing that how I am and what I am is a construction of flows in and flows out from the wider world surrounding me. If we start seeing self as smeared or spread across a wide area, indeed across the whole planet, we may bring a change of paradigm, a change of thinking, and feel the pain more personally about what's happening in the world. She also says that we should employ an active participatory pedagogy that critically questions every dominant norm, that draws upon diversity of perspective, that is very much, and I'll come on to this more soon, that is grounded deeply in specific place. These are, she says, key elements if we want our sustainability to be transformative. For Canadian Matthew Harmon, and I really don't know what's happening here every time I press for it. Okay, oh, it's that one, okay. Canadian Matthew Harmon and colleagues talk about sustainability learning that is transformable, then it must acknowledge and play with diverse ways of knowing and constructing meaning that the predominant Western scientific worldview has pushed to the margin. They use this term epistemological stretching, that for us to be able to affect deep, deep radical change, we have to realize that we need to draw on many more ways of knowing and understanding the world. And this, they say, aligns with the notion of cognitive justice, because what has happened is that the Western world has imprinted its highly scientific view of reality on the world and pushed to the margins other ways of knowing, other ways of seeing reality. And they call them for a stretched ways of knowing, and I'll make the case already that deeply involve the emotional and intuitive ways of knowing, and that these need to come into play properly in ways they haven't. And secondly, they say we really ought to investigate why this marginalization and peripheralization of ways of knowing has happened. How have we allowed Western scientific method and paradigm to have so much sway in the world? And we need other ways of seeing the world. What? Is this one again? Okay. Every time I touch it, it seems to go wrong. This is hardly the Midas touch. Another Canadian team, Barrett and colleagues, identify what they call 6 portals of understanding or threshold concepts for transformative sustainability learning. They say first that we should, again, widen the ways in which we encourage people to know anything, and we accept broader way of knowing. They talk of the need for intuitive learning, bodily responses to the predicaments we face, spiritual learning, learning through dreaming, learning that the sixth sense is vital in knowing what the world is about and what it is like. And they say that by stifling them, by disallowing the non-rational, we are actually helping foment unsustainability. By the limited ways we are allowing people to know, this is creating itself part of the unsustainable concept and context. They call too for a learning orientation in which nature is co-constructor of meaning, where if we open our senses and use our imagination, the natural world is literally able to speak to us and open our minds and our hearts. That this sounds strange is typical of the anthropocentric state we've got to, including, I would add, in the field of sustainability education. They also say that learning, and we heard this earlier, learning needs to be relational between different ways and sources of knowing, between different learners, between the human and the natural world that the learners inhabit. They argue too for intuitive learning, just knowing, the importance of gut feeling in our knowing, the importance of presentiment as we think about the future, about things that are maybe happening, the importance of precognition as part of our understanding, our precognition about concepts and situations. And they also say that a first-time realization by the learner that they have a worldview that informs but also limits their thinking needs to happen, but that this can be quite frightening. If we bring learners to understand that they have a particular window on the world shaped by gender, ethnicity, context, etc., we must all realize that that window is powerful in helping us see things, but it stops us seeing what's to the side of the window, above the window, below the window. A window stops us seeing certain things, and we have to help learners appreciate they have a window, see the strengths of that window, the limitations of that window, and learn from each other, other people, other learners, other co-learners with different windows on the world. They also say, and very importantly, that dominant beliefs in their power and stranglehold can undermine the validity of particular ways of knowing. I think this is very, very important because of its origins. The field of education for sustainable development has drawn primarily on the economic, the sociological, the scientific as ways of knowing. And there is a tendency for the field to court respectability by staying within the cognitive frames that come from those particular disciplines. And what we need to do is have different ways of knowing and legitimize different ways of knowing. Okay. All right. Going to South Africa, Haile Sitka, on the other hand, places the greatest emphasis on action learning. She calls for radically transformative and transgressive forms of learning that include a subversive action component. It's time for subversion, it's time for transgression, and this must be brought into our learning. So she calls for learning experiences, action learning experiences that undermine the resilience of unsustainable systems and practices, that develop in the student disruptive competences and confidence in disruption, that brings multi-voiced engagement with different actors, that addresses root causes of climate change and global dysfunction by speaking truth to power. The student needs to learn how to speak truth to power in all of these dynamical processes. And also, the student needs to turn her gaze on the disciplinary boundaries and other inhibiting boundaries within the learning institution. Because learning institutions constrain learning, and teachers must demand that, for instance, they break out of the science class and go to the music class or go to the art class and learn ways of knowing from those other disciplines. So there's time for breakout within our learning institutions, and the students should be privy to this, part of it, have agency in this. So let me summarize. These thinkers, with whom I share much in common and thoroughly commend with some enthusiasm, they hold that transformative sustainability education should, number one, mirror ecosystems in its flows and dynamics. Two, it should stretch the sources by which we say we know anything. That should give due space and weighting to non-rational and emotional learning. That engage learners in action learning that addresses and challenges unsustainability, giving them what we might call change agency, experience, and immersion. Establishing the links, though, between sustainability education and transformative education does carry its own baggage of problems. Then we should be aware of these. First, the word transformative in our field has been overused and uncritically overused. And you see that in policy and professional literature on ESD of various kinds. There's been a devaluing of the coinage of transformative. It has become something of what can be called a jelly slogan. Its meaning malleable according to the agenda of the user. The word is used glibly and rhetorically. George Monbiot, in an article of last week, referred to sustainability as having become a blah word. A blah word. So there are problems of overuse, devaluing the coinage of the term. Second, although sustainability educators embrace the idea of transformation, they share very little detailed consensus about the precise intent and purpose of transformative sustainability. In other words, there's a need for a lot more mutual dialogue, interrogation, and hence clarity concerning what it is that needs sustaining and what it is that needs to be transformed or transgressed. We don't know very clearly what these things are. Third, there is a less than complete understanding about how a transformative learning process unfolds and how it may be facilitated. There's a dearth of practical how-to literature in the form of learning programs, frameworks, and handbooks showing how a transformative process might actually unfold. What is the learning chemistry that activates transformation? How might the teacher facilitate transformation in clear, concrete terms? What are the ingredients? What are the processes? I would like to outline a subversive or a transgressive agenda for sustainability learning. But first, and briefly, but nonetheless I hope importantly, I'd like to propose an alternative idea for you to ponder on and hopefully discuss with me. And that is the idea of metamorphic learning. Metamorphic learning. Consider the egg of a butterfly. Laid on a suitable food plant, it hatches to release a caterpillar. When it sheds its skin several times as it grows and grows and munches away on leaves. And after a final shedding of the skin, it forms a chrysalis within which all its previous forms, and this is vital, all its previous form, the tissue and organs and body parts making up the caterpillar, disintegrate into a formless soup. A formless soup. This would have happened earlier to the caterpillar, destroying it, save for hormones in the caterpillar's body, what are called constraining or restraining hormones, that stop it going into the soup context or process before it was ready. Once in the chrysalis, these containing hormones inactivate and form breaks down. But in the soup, special, once dormant cells allow new form to emerge, what we know as the butterfly. Emerging from the pupa, it is seen to have transformed its behaviors and what it values. The original form, the caterpillar, could only walk. The new form can fly. The original form only relished eating leaves. The new form feeds on the delicious nectar of flowers. The process of metamorphosis is fundamentally different to transformation, suggestive of a crossing from one form to another. In transformation, one moves from one form to another through a series of forms, form of one kind or another, never being relinquished. It is a metamorphosis, on the other hand, metamorphosis, is rather a movement from form to formlessness to new form. In that process, there can be deep psychological change, deep transitions, a profound undercurrent of change, conscious or unconscious, in life directions. And this seems to me suggestive of a challengingly different conceptualization of transformative sustainability learning. First, we have, in this process, contained learning. This is what most of us get in our schools and our colleges. Learning within the bounds of existing ways of seeing the world. Largely status quo non-critical or supportive learning. Largely guided by and held in place by well-established, uncrossable markers, constraints and norms. But then out of that can come disillusion, learning that challenges and dissolves assumptions and established ways of seeing the world, that deconstructs norms, strips away known markers, that immerses the learner in confusion, and I'm using confusion here negatively, that will periodically surface disillusion and disorientation, that catalyzes and makes a benefit of dishevelment, disorder, and disarray. The soup, the learning soup, out of which, because of certain aspects of what we've created, will come regeneration. Learning that reframes ways of seeing the world, that generates new insights, that presents the learner with confusion. And here I'm using confusion positively from its Latin origins, confusio, to fuse together with. We often see it as a bad thing. It has its warm side too, does confusion. And this regenerative process can lead to what are called epiphany moments that can induce a disposition for countercultural, out-of-the-box learning and engagement. And then we reach engagement, action learning for what I will call beautiful trouble. The butterfly feels its wings. It behaves in new ways, with its spread wings, with its wide wings, with its powerful wings. And this process I'm suggesting can apply to an individual or learning group or even a learning community. I've presented it here in a linear fashion, but it can be circular and repeated. Dissolution and regeneration can easily happen at the same time, simultaneously. First attempts at engagement may well bring disillusion once again. And this process of learning, what I'm calling metamorphic learning, is rather similar to what we've seen from the worlds of quantum science and physics. Ilya Prigogine has this theory of dissipative structures. And in this theory, he says that if you have a system, natural or social, that's close to equilibrium, exceedingly well balanced, it's very hard to change it. In such a thing, because you do not see alternatives, creativity is very low. And relationships between what you are and the rest tend to be linear and contiguous, close at hand. Not much changes. It has an innately conservative element to it. But if we go on and push the system far from equilibrium, we make it much more open and volatile. We allow for deep creativity. We allow for non-linear, non-contiguous ways of relating things, and all sorts of previously unpredictable connections come to the fore. And this he calls the theory of dissipative structures. And I'm arguing for classrooms that become dissipative structures, where form and what is close and what is settled and what is well balanced fall apart. Hard to handle, but hey, you wanted to be teachers. Yet within the fields of ESD, there is there is a pervasive diffidence about whether sustainable... Oh, sorry, have I... Sorry, I've lost my way. So, having said this, I want to look at some of the things that would form a transformative or metamorphic curriculum and pedagogy and learning process. First, I want to look at ESD, economic growth, and consumerism. Such a learning program would challenge and unpack the ubiquitous neoliberal economic growth model. There's abundant evidence that fixation on economic growth is subjugating the planet to the voracious demands of the global marketplace and is greedily eating up ecosystems, cultures, and communities, what we call the ecosphere and the ethnosphere. It is the underlying driver of climate change as it promotes emissions, deforestation, and industrialized agriculture, and in the name of unfettered markets, tears down regulation. It has become an article of quasi-religious faith, what we call, and what this writer, Clive Hamilton, calls growth fetishism. In affluent societies, religious value seems to be invested in the most profane object, growth of the economy. Our political leaders and commentators believe it has magical powers that provide the answer to every problem. Growth alone will save the poor. If inequality causes concern, a rising tide lifts all boats. Growth will also solve unemployment. If we want better schools and more hospitals, then economic growth will provide. And if the environment is in decline, then higher growth will generate the means to fix it. It's become fetishist. Growth has become such an all-consuming force that it becomes difficult to imagine and articulate, let alone to implement, alternatives. Those that do propose alternatives are often viewed as ungrounded dreamers, as wreckers trying to take us back to a cave-dwelling existence. Yet, as Naomi Klein has said about climate change, at the heart of the matter is a choice between accepting levels of climate disruption that will pretty much change everything about our world, or alternatively, changing pretty much everything about our economy to avoid that fate. Yet within the fields of sustainable development and education for sustainable development, there's a pervasive shyness, a pervasive diffidence about whether sustainable development connotes sustainable growth. Learning objectives put out by UNESCO in 2017 for each of the 17 SDGs make several references to sustained, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, alongside multiple references to sustainable development. All this overriding the difficulty that sustainability and sustained growth are antithetical concepts that are being used interchangeably. We just use them one or the other without thinking how much they are enemies of each other. If ESD continues to rest easy with economic growth, and if economic growth is accepted as a driver of the dark synergies we face, then ESD is tantamount to applying disease as cure. So to confront this, what is needed, I suggest, is the following. Have learners interrogate and assess the global economic growth agenda, its culpability for the multi-crisis syndrome we face. Have learners be challenged by slow growth, no growth, or steady state and degrowth proposals and projects from around the world. And there are thousands of these, some of them incredibly visionary and wonderful. engage with, and if convinced, advocate for localized counter-growth and counter-globalization economies based on demonetized exchange, a gift economy, coinage of locally accepted validity that supports an economy, a local economy of proximity. So we need to have learners, I'm suggesting, move from the containment, and again referring to metamorphic learning, from the containment of a non-status quo critical stance to disillusion of the taken for granted, to a regeneration of ideas and understandings, in part through active involvement. In similar vein, learners need to address consumerism as a driver of economic growth. Consumerism that's been defined as consumption behind the level of dignified sufficiency. And the point as made by Clive Hamilton that it's consumerism creating a constant feeling of dissatisfaction is needed to sustain spending. Unhappiness, he says, sustains economic growth, and it is behind consumerism. For those living in affluence, what we buy has come to shape how we feel about ourselves, how we see ourselves. Consuming has become the essential means of buttressing our self-worth. I purchase, therefore I am. Consumerist identity falls far short of authentic identity and requires constant purchasing replenishment. So my second proposal for metamorphic learning is as follows. Have learners examine how consumerism relies on systematic exploitation of peoples and environments. Examine how consumerism has become key to personal identity. Facilitate processes of socio-emotional learning around identity and values, sources of insecurity and unhappiness that are deeply behind much that happens by way of consumerism. Experience and reflect on alternatives to consumer gratification. Scrutinize vested interests, the structural scaffolding of rampant consumerism. Having learners challenge rampant consumerism shifts the current orientation of ESD towards which proposes a consumerism that is individual preference focused and moves it to systems. I'm therefore proposing that what we need to get away from this, green consumerism carries the subliminal message that levels of modes of consumption can be made denying. Green consumerism does not really challenge consumerism at its roots. I'm calling for anti-consumerist education. Just at certain times we needed and still do, anti-racist education, anti-sexist education. Metamorphic learning for sustainability also calls for an unpacking and challenging of climate change denial. At all levels of our societies, personal through global, an eyes wide shut syndrome. There we go. An eyes wide shut syndrome characterizes responses to climate change. On the one hand, amongst many people, is an outward acceptance of the severity of the looming climate crisis. On the other hand, there's avoidance of following through with the deep-seated personal and societal transformation that this calls for. There's a cognitive dissonance between articulated perception and our very own problem response, and we heard some wonderful examples in the earlier keynote. While ESD has addressed climate change, it has not given much attention to climate change denial. The root problem here is the overly rational approach that ESD takes. Yes, there have been graphs, tables, pie charts, projections and data sets concerning climate change, all speaking to the rational brain, but the effect has fallen short of transformation of behaviours and attitudes. Why are people, knowing this, not changing their ways? Outside of times of crisis, there seems to be little motivation to action. The great writer Maya Hillman, deeply lugubrious about our prospects, has pointed out the uphill task we face. The world's population must globally move to zero emissions across agriculture, air travel, shipping, heating homes, every aspect of our economy. Can it be done without a collapse of civilization? I don't think so. Can you see everyone in a democracy volunteering to give up flying? Can you see the majority of the population becoming vegan? This pretty much explains one of the sources of denial. For action, though, to happen, the appeal needs to be to what George Marshall calls the emotional brain, using the tools of immediacy and proximity, showing local, tangible effects on people, using stories, using metaphor, using song. To effect transformation, to make eyes wide open, Marshall says, there needs to be an alchemical turning of base data into gold. Have the data, the scientific data, yes, but bring the emotional brain fully into play. The soup of dissolution is vital here, and it's the emotional aspect of learning that can make this happen. This leads me to a third proposal for metamorphic sustainability learning. Have learners develop media literacy skills for decoding and deconstructing climate change messages from whatever source. Develop the skills and capacities to detect and identify climate change denial, wherever it comes from. Respond emotionally and empathetically to climate change personal stories, disaster, loss, voices from the future. Let them listen to voices from the future. Become activists in combating disinformation, denial, inaction. Help them stir up beautiful trouble. Also missing from sustainability learning, especially in wealthy societies, and a case of further denial, is consideration of the social injustices embedded in climate change impacts and responses. Straightforwardly put, the people of the metaphorical north of the planet is primarily responsible for carbon buildup, but climate change effects are bearing down thickest and fastest on people and societies in the global south. This calls for restorative justice and listening to the voices of the south. And this brings more proposals. As I've just said, listening to the voice of the non-appropriated voice of the south as they speak of climate change destroying their lives. Have students engage in cosmopolitan dialogue. Have them create, with others from different parts of the world, educated activism to bring to open climate change. I'd like the discussion to bring the discussion even closer to our homes and talk of our relationship with nature. Words matter. A word research of international ESD literature reveals scant reference to nature or natural world. At best, nature is referenced through the word environment, a word George Monbiot describes as an alienating term that brings no pictures to mind. A word, too, derived in English from the French word environ, that which surrounds us but does not necessarily include us. The German word Umwelt similarly connotes something surrounding us, but of which we are not necessarily part. In recent UN pronouncements on ESD, UNESCO Roadmap of 2014, UNESCO Learning Objectives of 2017, UNESCO Issues and Trends document of this year, There are only occasional references to nature, and these occasional references conceive of nature as resource requiring sound environmental management, I'm quoting, and sustainable use. This usage aligns with the predominantly utilitarian, commodifying, and exploitative conception of nature captured in such terms as natural capital and ecosystem service that have become commonplace to our literature. In short, nature is being conceived as having instrumental, utilitarian value, but rarely intrinsic value. And this puts nature at huge disadvantage in ESD discourse. Michael McCarthy, in his wonderful book, The Moth Snowstorm, asks of instrumental valuing, what value do we give to butterflies, to birdsong? Are they just written off as the great ruination of nature gathers pace? Because in instrumental value terms, they seem to have not much value. The problem lies with the baggage that comes with the term sustainability. The term is born from a conjunction of scientific and economic thinking, as I've said, and on that account there's been a privileging of cognitive understanding above the emotional, the socio-affective. It's a plastic word, says Paul Kingsnorth. No one is ever going to stir the soul with sustainable development, writes Michael McCarthy. Sustainability does not inspire songs or poetry. Similarly, in my understanding, the German term Nachhaltigkeit lacks emotive quality. It is a cold word. In consequence, largely missing from ESD discourse are words and concepts that convey an intrinsic valuing and emotional entangling with nature. Where in the ESD literature do you see these words? Beauty, attunement, awe, ecstasy, enchantment, reverence, rhapsody, joy, wonder. Where are these words? Seen through a transformative lens, there is something self-defeating in this state of affairs. If in the name of sustainability, a largely resource and instrumental conception of nature has been allowed to brush aside the poetic, the numinous, the beautiful, how is the learner going to develop affinity with nature and thereby a readiness to defend nature against the destruction it is facing from the threat of unsustainability? In short, how is the emotional brain that spurs us to action to be galvanized? And my proposal is to bring to sustainability education a vernacular environmentalism based upon experiencing nature at close hand. It is this that can bring metamorphic shift to the learning process and commitment to defending the natural world. Oh no. Here's some statements to this effect. To celebrate the legislative landscape is not nostalgic but urgent. It is the harbinger of concern and activism. People exploit what they have concluded to be of value, but they exploit, but they defend what they love. And to defend what we love, we need a particularizing language, for we love what we particularly know. Not long ago, in communities, that hill over there had a name. That old tree round the corner had a name. We particularized language. And through that particularization, we loved what we saw. This can be put another way, as Antoine de Saint-Exupéry puts it. We defend what we love. It's the time, in other words, intimacy and affinity with natural place is the precursor of environmental attachment, environmental concern, and I'm suggesting environmental activism. Yet we are doing our best to destroy this in upcoming generations of children. Any chance of intimacy with the natural world is being lost. Atrociously, in 2015, the new version of the Oxford Junior Dictionary withdrew a long list of nature words no longer considered relevant to modern childhood. Away went ash, beech, willow, dandelion, buttercup, kingfisher. The words went, replacing them with the indoor or virtual words such as blog, broadband, voicemail. A Finnish-German team of education researchers found that trainee science teachers were only able to identify 23% of local plant species, but their job was to teach local biology. In 2012, UK research found that 11 to 15-year-olds spend half their waking day in front of a screen, and that the radius of activity, that is the area in which they roamed in their play, had shrunk by 90%. They didn't trespass further from home. It can be different. In our work, my organisation works in the Pacific Islands. We have seen how sustainability learning is being reformulated to reclaim traditional indigenous knowledge, vernacular naming of animate and inanimate features of landscape, and the revival of place-based story and song, and how this project is building an intrinsic value of nature, commitment to protect and preserve nature, and they've thrown away the UNESCO definitions of sustainability for what I'm just describing. What I'm suggesting I should underline is not turning away from the world. Parochialism in the English language has come to connote boundedness, insularity, the inward looking. But we can rather see the parochial as portal, an aperture through which to enter and connect with the world. So I'm proposing a different set, some further proposals in this regard. My point being that ESD uses the rhetoric of transformation, but has largely ignored the personal transformative potential and activist energies that can be unleashed through close-lived affinity and identification with the natural world. The emphasis has been on what nature can do for us, resource-wise, not what nature can do to us. What is needed is to enable the learner to engage in porous exchange with nature, to know a natural place enough for it to know we are there, so that it can talk back to us, to know, as we say, like the back of our hand. The fact that this makes us embarrassed to speak so, to smile, even snigger, is evidence of how far we have gone from what Max Weber called our disenchantment with the natural world, Entzauberung, the removal of magic, with the triumph of rationalism over other sources of knowing. So here is this further proposal for vernacular learning, for close engagement with nature, cultivating a sense of wonder in nature, and this leading to activism, but also seeing the local area as the entry point for global action, rather than letting globalization close off intimately known place to us. We also need, I think, to confront despair as prelude to authentic hopefulness. As my opening scenario from 2060 hopefully conveyed, we live in dark times and face dark synergies. Standing on an inclined plane can trigger a range of negative emotions and responses. We can feel dread, grief and despair. We can feel anger and frustration. We can feel overwhelmed and hopeless. We can try to deny and avoid what is happening. We can build virtual walls around us. We can immerse ourselves in substitute gratification, called consumerism. A commonplace response among sustainability educations is that this is too much gloom and doom, that it will disempower learners with such a negative approach. But I think we have to think this through carefully. Recognizing that present and future generations need hope, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of hope is appropriate? Is it a comfortable fiction based on keeping our eyes wide shut? Is our hope based on the idea of ever upward progress? Or is it a pared down or straightened hope born of confronting the present and likely future condition? Are we giving our students authentic hope or inauthentic hope? Joanna Macy has made a long-standing contribution to despair and empowerment work and processes that draw upon spiritual traditions and holistic thinking. Her activities show us a way of working through despair, pain and distress, grief and sense of loss over what is happening to the world, to have a renewed sense of renewal, a renewed determination to do things about it. It is significant that ESD has largely avoided the socio-emotional learning that engages with the pain of what is being lost in our unsustainable world. This, I say again, comes from its provenance as a field. If you look at the 2017 UNESCO learning outcomes for ESD, the so-called socio-emotional learning rarely leaves the cognitive sphere. It says things like, think about the emotions caused by this problem, not experience emotion. Look at them carefully. They are not largely socio-emotional goals, even though they're listed as such. Maya Ajala has voiced the opinion that unsustainability learning that is devoid of critical emotional awareness and articulation of emotional intelligence, where boundaries are being consciously or unconsciously set by the teacher that emphasizes the cognitive, then this in fact is a contribution to unsustainability. If we don't bring the emotional to the learning context, then we are fueling unsustainability in what we do. And I think this calls for more proposals. If I can make this work. Oh, God. Sorry, I don't know what's happening. Yeah, no, it does. It's a delay mechanism we have here. I'm proposing here then, have learners voice, hear and value shared feelings of despair and loss within supportive and trusting dialogic forums. Use creative expression of feelings using different art forms. Use meditative modalities that center mind with emotion for working through despair. Honor pain of loss through ceremony. Use visualization to envisage and feel dystopian futures and see a way through them. In other words, we need to take our students through a process of despairing, accepting, and acting. And I would like to close by offering a provocative lexicon. Out of what I've said, I think we need some word changes in what we talk about. Let's not talk about the environment anymore, or so much, but let's talk about nature or the natural world. Not biodiversity, but species profusion. Not climate change, which is oh so soft, but climate breakdown and turmoil. Not global warming, so cozy, it seems, by the fireside. But let's name it as to what it is, global heating. Not natural resources, but living systems. Not natural capital, but nature. Not economic ecosystem services, but life-enabling systems. Not nature reserves far away, but nature-rich areas. Not extinction, which denies the agency that we've caused it all, but let's call it as it is. It's biocide and ecocide. So that's my provocative lexicon. And in the last two slides, I won't go through these for time reasons, but we'll leave them displayed. I'm suggesting metamorphic learning, dissolution of the learning community into a soup of learning, involving learning that stretches the way how we know, that attacks assumptions and paradigms, the shibboleths we live by, that pushes learners far from equilibrium, that mirrors ecosystems, that creates optimal conditions for deep personal shifts in understandings and self-understandings, and that is close to nature. And I'm also suggesting a range of other things, when this thing will turn for me. Learning that stretches how we know and is grounded in cognitive justice, so on and so forth. They're a summary of things. Also, regenerative things we need to know. Learning that folds together and coalesces diverse ways of knowing. Learning that takes us through pain to new sense of purpose, and so on. And if we do this, I'm suggesting we can fly like the butterfly. But thanks very much for listening to me.